Okay. Hello and welcome to another edition of Ephlux Insights video series. My name is Baruch Khan. I'm the entrepreneur in residence for this program, and we are joined by Robin Bonn, the Director of Business Development at Seven, an agency in the UK, specializing in content marketing, but they do quite a few other things as well. And we're here today because Robin has written an impressive article in Warp Market Leader Quarter 1 issue for 2014 on owned and paid media, and it circles around content marketing quite a bit. So Rob, why don't you tell us about the article, or how you came about writing it, what the objective was in terms of what the reader was supposed to get out of it, and how this particular philosophy, this particular ideology has worked well with your clients.
Sure. Thank you. Will do. So I suppose the main thing about the article was that this was born out of a piece of research that we did last year, and that was driven by an observation, really, that clearly a lot of people are talking about content marketing right now, but it clearly means different things to different people. So in the US, content marketing is more often, not completely, but more often associated with a sort of B2B lead generation tool. And I think across Europe it differs as well. And in the UK it was always really the preserve of agencies like Seven, who used to be contract publishers and have expanded out from there into different types of ways of distributing that content, and become a far more sort of strategic editorially led brand comms discipline. But I think in the UK it's certainly becoming the case that there are more entrants into that market. So you've got media agencies, Mediacom, MEC, Universal McCann are all very strong in content and talk good game. You've got advertising agencies like BCTP launching content divisions. You've got Adam and Eve, DDB, doing the same thing. But there's a couple of issues. So firstly, with those new agencies piling into the market, they tend to take a fairly sort of video-centric definition of content. And I think for those guys, it's ostensibly a kind of production discipline. So they'll feel like they own the brand, the definition of that brand and the strategy for that brand. And actually, the creation of video content is largely, as I say, a sort of production discipline, which I think you can see by the kind of people in the posts, in the roles running those kind of divisions. But I think more broadly, the issue around content is certainly the debate around it has been mainly centered on the idea that content marketing all of a sudden is the future, and everybody's talking about it, and it's a sort of panacea. And all other forms of marketing communication are rendered defunct or dead, and it's crazy. It just makes no sense. The world doesn't need another article on content agency says content is the best thing ever, and it's just not helpful. And in fact, I mean, as much as most of the marketing world hangs on what Seth Godin says, there's a very famous quote of his that content marketing is the only marketing that's left, and we disagree with that wholeheartedly. So to come back to the question, the reason that we started that research and started to look at what we were describing as converged media, which wasn't an original term from us, I should add, was just a sense of how does content marketing work with other disciplines, rather than it being positioned as being something that is all you ever need, because I don't think that's helpful to clients who are looking to invest in content. It's also not been our experience, with the clients that we work with. We work very well with other types of disciplines, and I think it's a question of just finding the right balance of what content should be doing for your business, what types of content are most appropriate, how you best able to provide entertaining or useful or relevant content to an audience. So I suppose that was kind of where the article was born. So we went away and did this research. I won't go through it in too much detail. I'm aware this is a very long answer to one question, but we tried to sort of set some baselines around the sort of scale of content marketing and some definition around the breadth of it. So we looked at all of the different types of owned media channels, which clearly there's a good sort of 12 or 15 of those at least, video being one of them, that you could describe as being a good distribution channel for the type of content that brands could create. So we just sort of to sort of define our terms a little bit and the size of the market, and we found that about roughly sort of 20% of brand com spend in the UK was being spent on owned media, and that figure has been replicated in other studies since. So we're pretty confident that that's accurate. But I think the other main aim of the research, as well as sort of broadening the the kind of dialogue around content, was just to give some good, sound, practical advice to people about what content is good for and what it's not. So we took the view of having a look at the customer journey, and obviously you have to be fairly reductive, but broke it down into sort of 4 or 5 stages in terms of looking at 2 things. Firstly, brands or marketeers' attitudes to what they felt content was good for. And then secondly, probably far more interestingly, we looked at consumers on a sector-by-sector basis to understand, okay, how are those guys using content at each stage of the customer journey. And I think once you get yourself out of the kind of content is the savior of everybody mentality, the findings provided substance, which I think probably someone who didn't have a particular cause to fight for, a particular discipline to try and talk up, the results were as you might expect, in as much as the reality is far from being dead. If you're looking to reach an audience and make them aware of a new product or service, there's really very little that beats TV. It delivers huge numbers very quickly, and it costs, of course, but that's kind of been the dynamic that's always been. And you start to move through the sales cycle, if you like, or the customer journey. You start to see other owned media channels coming into play more and more. As you'd expect, as people start to research and compare, people very quickly go to the website, and as you start to really make a distinction and purchase products, again, other types of channels come into play more and more, so web and email and so on. One of the interesting things was the role of, there's a real disparity in the role of in social media. I think a lot of marketeers we spoke to felt like the role of social was sort of much earlier in the customer journey, and actually our research showed that people were tending to use social more in the sort of post-purchase keeping in touch phase, which I think probably reflects the way that brands have been generally speaking sometimes quite conservative, understandably so, with the way they've used social media. Effectively more as a customer service channel rather than being something to proactively use earlier in the customer journey.
Yeah, so sorry to stop you there, but so you're saying customers are not looking at online when they're evaluating or looking between choices? So during the journey there's awareness, then there's duplicate alternatives. They're not looking at the second step, the alternatives part. They're not searching online to check where what one particular product that they want, who else is providing that same product, the locations that you can find it. None of that's happening online or on applications.
No, sorry, just to be clear, it's particularly the results of social media that we were talking about.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely, the customers are looking at a variety of online sources to help them, really from pretty much being aware of a product or service. They're using online sources, constantly. It was particularly the role of social media. I think that the client sample we talked to expected that to be more prevalent earlier in the customer journey, and I think we found that actually it was certainly the consumer sample were telling us that it was more prevalent later in that customer journey. So it gave us some good stats around, and how that dynamic, that variation of the roles of owned media, i.e. content marketing, varied from different sectors. So that was really useful. And I think probably what it helped us to crystallize was one of the frustrations I have with content marketing is, many of the practitioners in content tend to define what they do in terms of the channels through which they distribute that editorial content. And I think, if you look at any agency discipline now, whether it's an ad agency or a digital agency or a DM agency or indeed a content agency, so many of them are saying the same thing. It's about having, an idea or a thought or whatever you want to call it, big ideas, small ideas, long ideas, whatever the term might be, and then distributing it across the right channels for the job. Now, of course, that's absolutely right. It may be that you have an advertising idea which is placed in all sorts of different locations. You may have a sort of more of an editorial idea which again can be distributed in all sorts of different ways. But the reality is, I think that sort of defining a discipline, in this case content marketing, in terms of the channels that it's distributed through, it's no more descriptive now than an author saying, oh, I'm an author, I use books. And it tells you nothing. It tells you absolutely nothing about the talent of the author, the audience they're going after. It's just it's a part of doing business now that you have to be multi-channel. So we really tried hard to think about how to frame content marketing in a way which really focused on what it does. What does content marketing deliver, rather than how do we deliver it? So rather than banging on about being multi-channel, we felt that when we looked at the clients we work with, and I'll give you an example in a second, we felt that what content actually is really good at is helping to make, we talk about keeping brands real. It's about the sense that if you take that kind of collaborative approach to the way that particularly advertising and content marketing works together, the advertising is really good at making a brand promise. So one of our clients in the UK is the supermarket Sainsbury's, and they're obviously very well known, and their advertising agency does a beautiful job in crafting this promise, which is live well for less. And that's not a skill set we have, it's not an aspiration of ours, it's something that we could never do anywhere near as well as the ad agency, Abbott Mead Vickers, BBDO. And obviously they work very closely with the media agency, PhD, to do that fantastically well. So they make the promise. But what happens next? So if you're sitting on your sofa and you see a TV ad or a press ad for Sainsbury's and it says live well for less, you think that sounds good, I'd like living well and I'd like to do it for less. What happens now? So what content does, it gives people a sense of how. It helps deliver on that brand promise, every day, everywhere, whenever the customer comes to the brand, whether they're on their mobile phone, whether they're in the store looking at a recipe card, or whether they're paying their own money for a magazine, or looking at a website, or watching video, or responding on social, whatever it's going to be. It's that sense that if you have that singular view of delivering on that brand promise, that is what content's really good at. And that's what our proposition as an agency is really built around. And that's, I suppose, the payoff to the article in Market Leader, is the sense that, with that research, we've sort of seek to sort of flesh out the relationship between, particularly between advertising as the sort of main owner of brand com spend, advertising in the broadest sense, and what content can do to support it. Because, the reality is that, if you have content to show people how to do something, it's useful or informative or helpful, then it makes the value of the advertising spend go further. And likewise, build it and they will come. People often say about content, it's not true. Build it and they might come. But actually, if you introduced a relationship with paid media to help drive traffic, whether that's footfall and offline traffic or or online traffic, then clearly your content is going to be seen and hopefully found useful by more people. So it's a very kind of symbiotic, complementary relationship really between advertising and content marketing. And really, I suppose that's the message of that piece in Market Leader.
Yeah, there was actually this case study of Kraft Foods coming out with recipe books for all their products, and then send it to the customer, so the customer would see what they can do at the end of the day with that particular product or that particular recipe, or those pastes and things like that. But I want to touch upon something else. So we have very little time left, so I think we have about 5 minutes left. I just want to touch upon two things that are stated independently in your article. So at one point you mentioned that 30% of the users, of the 2,000 people that were surveyed, 30% said that they want both education and entertainment in their content, in the content marketing that they are targeted towards them. At the same time, you talk about the customer buying decision journey. At the third, and then at the stepping away from your article, there's this concept now possibly emerging on Twitter. I use Twitter a lot, and it is on Facebook right now, where there's video advertising. The concept of video advertising will probably emerge, and like you rightly mentioned earlier, most of the marketers, when they think about content marketing, they think about videos or infographics, for that matter, in terms of lead generation or interest building. What would you advise CMOs in 2014 how they would leverage this information that, first of all, 30% of the people, which is probably the majority which you're referring to, out of everyone that was surveyed, they want content, they want education and information at the same time on how they can get to the how aspect. At the same time, how would that content marketing change in its tone, in its basically what you're saying is 30% said we want 50% education, 50% information. But how would that number change as you go from awareness to looking at alternatives, then looking at when they're comparing, and then in the final aspect when they're talking about it? So could you tell us how that would break down as the buying
Sure.
decision journey goes, and then it comes back in a group?
Sure, sure. I mean, I suppose what
Yeah.
you've kind of hit the nail on the head really, which is to kind of get beyond the what content are we going to create, and where are we going to distribute it. There's not much to be gained at looking at generic surveys or sort of broad statistics about what people generally want from a particular channel, because what you've really described is the need for each organization to have a single content strategy. And I think until you've gone through that process, you need to find out what is the unmet need on behalf of your specific audience. Have you got enough clarity about that audience? One of the first things we often do, there's almost two stages generally to what we do. The first thing is establish that content strategy, and that's a sort of linear piece of consultative work. And then it's much more of a sort of cyclical process about planning, creating, distributing, measuring content on an ongoing basis. But the reason that strategy
Right.
piece comes first is because often there are, real gaps in a business's knowledge about, what content have we got, what's working well, what isn't. Do we really have an understanding from editorial sense as, what it is that we're trying to say? What are the kind of outcomes we're trying to get to? What is the tone of voice that we're trying to seek? And really what you're trying to nut out is the kind of, what is the crossover between the kind of, the business agenda, the marketing objectives, and the sort of unmet need on behalf of the audience. And I think that's a very editorial thing. We're not talking about a campaign where we're trying to reductively say, to get a product benefit across, for example. What we're trying to do is provide something which is genuinely useful or entertaining or valuable. And of course it will have, have real kind of, shareability if it's good. But that's a kind of consequence of getting this strategy bit right. If you know what that unmet need is on behalf of your audience, and you really know that audience well, and they know, have a sense of what you have permission to be an authority on, then you can start to get into questions about, okay, we kind of know who we are and what we want to say and who to. Then we can start thinking about, well, what does that content plan look like? What channels should we be operating in? And that's where it becomes more of a sort of, channel planning exercise where, you've got that sense of sort of what and who, and now it's a question of where. And then you start to lead in, as I say, into that more cyclical part when you've got all of that editorial plan, set, and that takes in everything else which is happening in the brand. It has everything else that's happening from a seasonal perspective, and general elections coming down the line, or economic trends, or it's a very broad picture that you're trying to insert your content into, because something we remind ourselves every day: the world does not need any more content. So if you're going to create something new, you better make sure that it's good. Otherwise, total waste of time. So I think that's where the discipline of developing a content strategy in the broadest sense is absolutely the starting point for any brand. Get a content strategy and take it from there.
Yeah, actually, just one last point. I actually had shown the publication to our investor before speaking to you, and when people who are really, I would say, extremely successful in their lives, in the multi-millionaire status, when they read articles like this, they think to themselves like, yes, it's true, but on these fixed variables. So like one of the points he brought up was, his name is Ali Nassim. One of the points he brought up was, you talk about in your article, you make a distinction between B2B and B2C as if they're independent roles. But there's some businesses, like for example, one of his clients is Starbucks. So one aspect of their business is 65 to 67% of their revenue comes from selling coffee beans directly to retailers or directly to consumers, and the remainder amount comes from what they have on the ground level outlets and all that. They make their sales from there as well. So businesses that have a B2B and a B2C approach towards everything, towards their revenue stream, how would you advise them on how to go about their content marketing? Because you would have different messages for different stakeholders, wouldn't you? From your shareholders, obviously it varies quite a bit, but B2B customers and B2C customers, although at the end of the day they might be the same person, but who's buying first in terms of your primary sales and your secondary sales, that changes the content quite a bit. So could you talk about that if you can spare like 2 two, three
Yeah,
more minutes.
sure. I mean, very briefly, none of the old rules of marketing have just suddenly disappeared just because this sort of editorial discipline has come to the fore. If you've got
Yeah,
a different audience group, that are driven in different ways with different decision-making processes and sort of different emotional drivers of those decisions,
yeah,
then you will treat them in different ways. And I think, it may be that as an organisation with what are effectively different business units with different probably different ownership and different objectives, then perhaps you need two separate content strategies.
yeah,
But I mean, to be fair, I think probably quite a lot gets, clearly there are fundamental differences between the way you communicate with consumers and the way that you communicate with businesses. Not least often the decision-making process within businesses is clearly very different. But again, there are also a lot of grey areas where, you're almost talking in a B2B sense to a, wealth management is probably a good example where you're talking to, exclusively sort of, high net worth individuals. They are generally sort of, captains of industry. And those people are, typically, very senior in sort of large corporate organizations. So, the reality is that with all B2B marketing, I think that the people at the other end of whatever it is you're sending to them, they're human beings as well. So I think a lot of the sort of thing we talked about in the last question about having a real understanding about, what is it that's missing in their lives that the brand has the skills and the authority to, to provide. There's a generosity, I think, at the heart of good content marketing, which is perhaps absent, from advertising. It doesn't make advertising bad; it just makes it different. There's a sense of, when you really know your audience, you can create stuff for them, and it's not to say that it doesn't, pull for you or drive sales or bring down cost per acquisition and all the other good things that content marketing does. But there is that generosity at the heart of it that you know your audience really well and you can create something for them. And I think that equally applies to B2B or B2C marketing.
that's brilliant. That's exactly the point in your article that I liked the most, which was basically, well, you didn't really touch upon it directly. You were quite polite about it, but advertising communicates in one way, obviously, and it's just talking about here's a brand and here's some awareness about it. But content marketing says here's how this brand can improve your life, and here are some ways you can go about that. So regardless of B2B or B2C, it really works out that way. Anyway, Rob, I know you have another call after this, so thank you for your time, and I hope to speak to you soon. I'll be connecting you to a couple of people that I think you can benefit with quite a bit. So again, thanks for your time, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thank
Take
you very
care.
much. Thank you. Cheers.